Yeah, so my name's Amanda Hunter. I'm here with three hats. I am the co-founder of Unlock Care Homes, which campaigned against the visiting restrictions during the COVID lockdown. I'm also here as Families Against Involuntary Medical Euthanasia, which I co-founded with other families who have been impacted by the end-of-life protocols that were ramped up during the lockdown period. And then I'm also here as the chair of Together Declaration Health and Social Care. And we have a number of campaigns at the moment. One of them is assisted dying, but that is all tied in with the end-of-life protocol abuses. We also campaign against state overreach in people's lives in the context of social care and health. And we also campaigned for care workers who were sacked because they refused the mandate.
The whole COVID story, there's so many factors in it. And each one of them is as horrific as the next one and the last one. You know, you've got what we've done in the lockdown, the care homes, the end-of-life protocols, how we administered some of the drugs. Then we get on to the mental health aspect of people in their houses, then people losing their jobs and, you know, because they wouldn't take a vaccine, or losing their jobs because they asked questions. Then we'd get the whole vaccines and the vaccine injured, and the whole thing is just stinks.
Massive.
Yeah, there's so many bits of it. But I think the interesting parts were the early days where we were like, what? Old folk, we can't go and see them. And I think, you know, you'll be able to tell that story, what actually went on there. And then not only what went on with families not being able to go and cuddle their old folk, you know, and the mental health benefits to both parties and being able to do that was taken away from us, and celebrating Christmases and birthdays and all these things through glass was just, it was horrific to witness that, even from the outside. And then when you started hearing how we actually dealt with the sort of palliative care, end of life protocols, all this stuff, it just was a horrific story, and I think you'll be well versed to tell me more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I first got involved in campaigning because this was in late 2020. So my mother was in a care home. I fought for a year and a half, actually, between 2020 and 2021 to get her out of the care home. I had lasting power of attorney. That meant nothing during lockdown. So I was told that it was in my mum's best interest to stay in a tiny room for 24 hours a day for 14 months. My mum was bedbound. So some people have talked here today about people who were isolated for 14 days. My mum was isolated for 14 months in that room. She saw staff maybe 3-4 times a day for meals and probably a few more times because she needed repositioning. But other than that, she saw nobody. And I was able to get access because my mum was deemed to be in her last year of life. Long story, she wasn't. But because she was deemed to be in her last year of life, I was able to have 1 hour access per week. And she had advanced dementia as well. And I had 1 hour a week. I had to make a 7-hour round trip by car. I had to have a special permission to be driving. You know, my friend took me. I didn't drive, so it was a 7-hour round trip, and I'd get there, my mum would be comatose because they'd put her on lorazepam. Now, this was another problem during the period because my mum had already been put on this drug in late 2019. Long story I won't go into. But I was against that, and that was pushed forward, and I didn't know my mum was on that drug. And I then discovered it in 2021. It turned out that my mum had been on that drug for 2 years with no review. Now that drug, lorazepam, is counterindicated for people with dementia, especially for a long term, and should be reviewed after 6 months. My mum lost half her body weight. She went from a size 14 to a size 6 in that year. She was an absolute skeleton. and yet there was no review of her drugs. So what happened is I'd go there for my hour, and invariably I would find my mum totally out of it. She could hardly communicate with me. Initially in 2020, things were not so bad. I'd see her, she was able to communicate. But because she was now she wasn't being assisted with food and drink as much as she should have been. She was isolated in that room. She often got forgotten. And then she was on these drugs that, sedate you. So basically, when they did go in to give her food and drink, they were saying, well, she wasn't interested. And the reason is because she was so out of it. She could hardly, open her eyes. So, as I said, I fought for a year and a half to get my mum out of there. I finally got her into a nursing home nearer to me. And that was appalling. The level of care was absolutely atrocious. Now, I was able to negotiate with the care home, because I said that, when we were looking for an alternative for my mum and it was being, decided by social services, I wanted to bring my mum home. I was being told, no, well, this is a sort of interim period. We'll put her into a nursing home and we'll see how things go. And I was adamant I wanted to bring her home. But that was an ongoing fight. So she went into the nursing home. Things deteriorated very quickly. I was able to negotiate 7 hours, 8 hours visiting a day. By that time, this is 2021, we had what was called essential caregiver. Now, this home said, we don't do it here, as if it was something on some sort of menu, but I negotiated because they had lost quite a few people through COVID. They needed the beds filling, and I was able to negotiate with them that I would have 7 hours. And it was very convenient for them because I was the one feeding my mum. So they didn't have to have staff at lunchtime or evening. So that was the period I went in. And as I saw the care deteriorating and some very serious points, over medication. My mum was being given somebody else's medication. She wasn't being given the antibiotics she needed in a timely fashion. She wasn't being supported, although she had to have her medications covertly. So there were so many lapses in the care, also in the repositioning, the hours between when it should have been every 2 hours. So many, many things. It all blew up when I complained that my mother was being administered antibiotics, which are really foul tasting, squirted into her mouth. And she was spitting it out. Obviously, it was all down her. She was just being left like that. And I complained about the poor care, and this ended up with me being restricted access. So now my mum only had 3 to 4 hours of support, and I had to divide that between lunch and evening meal. So all the rest of the time, she was not being supported with fluids. My mum could not eat and drink alone. She had to drink through a straw with help, and she had to be fed with a spoon. So, I actually saw once through a window the care staff go in there. They didn't know I was watching through the window. I'd had to do a COVID test, and I was watching through the window. They didn't know. The lady came in and she basically plonked the tray down. My mum was in the wrong position, was like prodding the food at her mouth, and my mum was sort of doing this, and then after 10 minutes the carer went away. She wasn't interested in eating, and this is what was going on, so my mum ended up in hospital, and it was only because she ended up in hospital that I got her home, but she went on an end-of-life care pathway. So what happened was my mum went into hospital. I was denied access 7 days. I was saying my mum needs support. She needs me to help her feed and drink because she won't be able to do that. And I know you're very short of staff. Please let me in. No, we have no concerns over her food and fluid. 7 days later, I get a call from the consultant. Your mother is dying now. You can come in. And I went in and I found my mum virtually comatose. And I started giving her food and drink. And I was told I was cruel.
What, feeding her?
Yeah.
That's cruel?
Yeah, I was told I was cruel, that she was dying now, that I had to accept this, and that I would be overloading her, and this was a really cruel thing to do, and you're a selfish daughter. This is what I was told by the nursing staff, yes.
By feeding your mother?
Yeah. So I proved over the next 7 days that my mum was not dying, that she drank. By day 7, my mum was eating and drinking normally, So I started off with about 300 mils a day, next day 500, next day 700. By the end, my mum was drinking 1,000, mils of fluid, which is the minimum really recommended amount.
A litre a day is...
Yeah. And she was eating as well. So I had to go through the court of protection to get my mother home. And I got her discharged on what is called a CHC fast track, which I had to fight for. The hospital and social services and CHC, this is continuing healthcare, were conspiring behind my back to put my mum in a care home. And I contested that. I put a statement to the Court of Protection. I won my case. Very few people end up there. They don't know about it. They don't know the process, and they would have accepted it. I denied that, and my mum came home and she lived another 14 months.
Brilliant. Brilliant. See these issues that you faced, it's kind of horrific. But how many of them are exasperated purely because it was during COVID, so we need to do things different? I mean, that wasn't normal, all these things that you had to go through, I would hope.
No, and for example, lasting power of attorney, that should have been, when I said, no, my mum should not be on this palliative care programme, and I'm saying so, and I'm her lasting power of attorney, I should not have been told it's irrelevant. And then, when I pushed it, they told me it had been revoked. And that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to revoke my power of attorney so that they could make the decisions. And the thing is, what was happening, the reason I started campaigning was because of what was happening to my mum. I reached out on social media, I met some other people, we got together, we founded Unlock Care Homes, and we campaigned against the visiting restrictions. But the problem is these practices, and this is what we feared at the time, became embedded. I mean, it was very convenient for care homes to not have family scrutinise the care, what was going on. And we said at the time that once these practices are introduced, it will be very, very hard to reverse these practices when lockdown is lifted. And that's exactly what's happened. So the care sector now, if you complain about poor care, often your relative will be evicted. My mother was evicted because I complained about poor care. Or they will be restricted in their visiting, and it's in the best interest. You are upsetting your relative. So the power is in the hands of the care providers, but also the state, because the social services will rubber stamp whatever the care home says. CQC, Care Quality Commission, does not only investigates a tiny minority of cases, and they will not look into individual cases. So you'd have to have a number of people coming together to make a complaint. Of course, that you couldn't do that during during lockdown, because visits were staged. You couldn't, they were, you wouldn't even meet people in the car park a lot of the time. They would, separating people. So it was very, very difficult to have any kind of protest. So
that's a good point, because up here, I don't know if I've got it down south, Care Commission, and they basically are the auditors of care providers up here, whether it's old folks or child homes and all that stuff. But they only visit once a year. So if you're going to do an audit any business, and you know you're coming, the place smells of paint, nobody's off that day, all the beds are clean, and you think, well, or whatever, it might be a few days to do these audits, but it's kind of difficult. But it's horrific. So do you feel then some of the stuff that we adopted during COVID, we're still just running with because it became...
Well, yes, and I think that's that. It's once something becomes embedded in the culture, it's extremely difficult to reverse it. And of course, it was so much easier. There were good care workers, but there were some terrible care workers, and they were going on social media and saying, "Oh, it's great, I haven't got the families on our backs now, And of course, this was so dangerous to the people inside because if you're in a care home, 70% of people in care homes have some kind of cognitive impairment. How would they be able to explain their symptoms over remote medical access? They wouldn't. So they were reliant on care staff who are not medically trained to triage them for a consultation online or over the phone. And then on that basis, it would be decided what should be done. But in the beginning of the pandemic, the lockdown, in the beginning of lockdown, when remote access was introduced, there was also another protocol that was introduced, NG165, which was basically saying, assume that anyone has symptoms like flu symptoms, has got COVID, that they don't have a bacterial infection, that they've got COVID, and therefore do not give them antibiotics. Well, if you're in a care home, very susceptible to respiratory infection, people were being denied antibiotics, and antibiotics have to be administered very quickly and in a very timely fashion. And of course, that wasn't happening. People weren't getting antibiotics, and then they were being put on end of life.
Yeah, no, it's a whole horrific topic, and the more and more people I talk to, it's just you think, how many mistakes did we make through this whole thing? Did we get any bits of this 2 years? The timeline. Did we get any right? And now what I can't understand is, I'm influenced by two governments, Westminster and Holyrood. So it's kind of a lot of people touched the ball before these decisions reached me and people in my community. Yet none of them seem to get any of it right. But you see the protocols that were put in place for end of life, and basically that's the drug that I can never say, midazolam. That's the one. Are these protocols still in place? Please tell me they're gone, they're out in the bin now.
No. So the protocol that was brought in at the beginning of the COVID period, which was in April, that was NG163. Now, NG163 was replaced a year later by NG191. What's interesting about 163 is it was actually mentioned today, is that when that protocol was introduced, palliative care consultants wrote to an open letter to the British Medical Journal saying that this was a really dangerous protocol and that it should be urgently reviewed. They welcomed the fact that guidance had been made, but really that should not be used on elderly people. And also the administration of two drugs, benzodiazepine and opioids, should not be used together, certainly not in the doses that were being recommended. And that's what the consultants contested, was the fact that the doses were being prescribed on these protocols. So it wasn't like you've got a medic who is in front of his patient and deciding on the basis of his knowledge and his expertise and the patient in front of him how best to treat this patient. It was basically a tick box.
Yeah.
And and even defining what doses of drugs should be used. And there was the message: do not get concerned about administering these two drugs together, even though there is a risk of respiratory repression.
Basically, ignore your own common sense logic.
Exactly, and the same with NG165 over the antibiotics, because everybody knows that even if you have a viral infection, you can often get a bacterial one as well. So why were people? And the thing is, you can't determine if somebody's got a bacterial or viral infection over the phone, can you?
Listen, I'm not medically trained. But even with my limited knowledge, I understand that if someone's got an infection, the kind of best thing you can give them. We were telling folk you couldn't get it.
Well, yes, but I mean, and obviously for a viral infection, antibiotics don't work, you know, but for bacterial infections, it's essential. But people have been denied these. And
So
then
if you've got an
there's
ear infection or a throat infection or whatever other type of infection, I kind of like, okay, well, I kind of know that, and you probably need these drugs. We're saying, no, you don't get those drugs. And you're saying these things are still in place then?
Well, no, not the one on antibiotics, but NG163 was replaced by NG191. If you go and look for NG163, it's been completely removed from the NICE website. Now, that is very unusual.
They would just still leave it as old.
Yeah, but you can't even access it. Wow. We have a copy because we downloaded it, we uploaded it at the time.
The replacement of that, which was still, was that still implemented under COVID times?
Yes, and it was a rapid response protocol for people with respiratory infection and who might be also at end of life. But the problem is that people were being denied the treatment and antibiotics and other treatments. So they were deteriorating and then they were being put on an end-of-life protocol. Wow. So they were denied access to medical treatment. Now, the problem is that these protocols, okay, NG163 has been replaced by 191, but the protocols are very similar. And now NG191 is also removed the doses of the drugs. It now refers to another protocol, which is NG31, but that is actually for people with cancer. It was designed for people in the last weeks of life who have cancer, not for the elderly who have other, medical problems.
But these are still in place.
NG191 is still in place. It's still linked to COVID, but you have other protocols. You have NG31, which, as I say, was designed for people with cancer. But these protocols are being used almost like in a blanket fashion. So we often hear of families who have been told that their loved one has reached their treatment ceiling, that they're over 65 and they will not be treated, and therefore they will be put on, no treatment will be given. They deteriorate quite obviously, and therefore if they end up in hospital, often they are not treated. So you've got a do not attempt resuscitation has become almost like a shorthand for do not attempt treatment in many cases. And people are under the misconception that a DNAR has to have your consent. It doesn't. It doesn't have to have the consent of the family or the individual if the medic decides that is appropriate. They have to consult you. They should consult you. And we have many stories of falsified signatures on DNARs, people being accosted, 3 times a day at their bed, at their most vulnerable, being pushed and to sign a DNAR. Now, why would that be? And it seems to us, from the evidence that we have, is that this is being used as a way of rationing care. We know that there is rationing within the NHS. There isn't enough money in it. And so the NHS is having to ration care, and it's doing it with the elderly and the disabled and people with learning disabilities. And of course, all this was ramped up during the lockdown period. But these cultures, these practices have become normalised in many, many hospitals. I'm not saying all of them, but many.
Well, I think a lot of people more intelligent than me would suggest that to make something a habit form, and you need to do it for about a month. We've now been doing these since 2020. So you've got loads and loads of people who have been working to these restrictions and whatever that you want to term them. You're right. It's a whole mind shift that's needed now to get back to normal, get back to pre-2.
But I think what is dangerous is the protocolization of medicine, and we're it's an international trend. This trend towards guidelines in medicine. Guidelines should only ever be guidelines, but they're being used prescriptively, rigidly, and they're being applied to people that they should not be applied to. So we've had lots of stories, even in the last few weeks, of people being told that their loved one has reached their clinical treatment ceiling, will not be given medication. then medications, all their medications that have already been prescribed, maybe for chronic conditions, maybe they've got heart problem, maybe need blood thinners, these are all removed. The person is then denied food and drink, and or becomes weakened because they're not, they're not getting their medications, they're deteriorating. We know that the NHS is under pressure. People don't have enough staff to assist people with food and drink. Often the food is put away, out of their reach. Communication about whether this person needs assistance, like with my mother, is not passed on, and so people are becoming starved and dehydrated in hospital, and of course they weaken. Once they become weakened, then they'll say we need to sedate them because they're becoming agitated, and then maybe the end of life drugs come in. But it's a process, and I think there's a danger of focusing far too much on midazolam and morphine. That comes at the end of the process. How it begins is somebody being told, you've reached your clinical treatment ceiling, we are not going to treat you, then withdrawing your medications, then you become weak, you're not getting enough help with food and drink, you deteriorate. Then they can say that if you are sedated because you've become agitated because you're not getting your medications and you're not getting enough sustenance to continue, then they can say, well, you require clinically assisted nutrition, a tube, and that's a treatment. By law, that is a treatment now. So they can withdraw it. They can decide.
Of course. You might even get the basics of food and water, because if you need your fluids intravenously, absolutely, and you need your food through a pipe, then that's obviously a treatment.
Law now that if they decide that it's not appropriate, and this happened to a family that we were helping. The mother had a stroke, ended up in hospital, and she was denied food for 46 days.
No.
Now, after 2 weeks of somebody of that age, she was an elderly woman, but she was very fit before she went into hospital. And she was breathing without a ventilator. The family said they wanted her to be put on with a food tube. Something went wrong, and they refused to reinstate the food tube. And the family contested this and said, no, well, there are other ways, there are other means. Please, can we explore other means? They were told, and we have this on the recording, this is not your decision to make. We are the medics, we are the professionals, it's our decision. This is not a decision that is in your hands to make, and we're helping you here, and this is our decision. And the family contested it. What should have happened at that point is the hospital should have taken that case to the Court of Protection. I don't know what you have in Scotland, but they should have taken it. But when there's a dispute between the family or the individual and the hospital, that should be taken to the Court of Protection. They refused to do that. We helped the family get to the Court of Protection. When the case was heard, the lady had been starved for 46 days. She was still going. I mean, you and I would have difficulty after a week or two.
48 hours?
Yeah. So this was a proof that this woman was not dying.
Far from it.
But then the judge decided that it was in her best interest to deny her hydration. 11 days it took her to die. 11 days. It's the most horrific death.
Well, thanks very much for giving me your time, especially you've been here today already, spent a lot of time talking to the audience upstairs. So thank you you've opened my eyes to a number of things. One thing I think is quite inspirational though, is if you didn't scream, kick and punch, your mum wouldn't have got those last 14 months.
No.
On a very personal level, grilling right down to the personal level. And that's a bit scary.
Well, it's very scary when you also think that I'd been told 3 times that my mum was dying. Yeah. 3 times, and she defied every single prognosis. And that is why this is so important to the assisted dying legislation that they want to bring in.
Listen, I know through personal experience I've lost both my parents now, and you just want them to live forever. But the way nature has it, and they would not have it any other way. They wouldn't want to bury us. Us burying them's kind of the way they want it as well. And it's a terrible time. And we all want as long as possible. But, you know, testament to you getting that extra 14 months makes me consider how many people have not had the knowledge, the willpower, or the enthusiasm and the drive to do what you've had to do. And we shouldn't have to do that.
No, you shouldn't have to do that. And you shouldn't have to fight.
You fought for 14 months, or you didn't fight for 14, but because of the fighting you done, it gave her.
For basically 3.5 years, because I had...
For well before that. But if you didn't do that fight, you'd not get that 14 months. And I think, well, in reality, how many people didn't get that time? Even a day, an hour. We would all have an extra.
Yeah, and often people were told, well, you know, your loved one's dying anyway. But, you know, I was told that 3 times. But in some cases, that might have been true that they were nearing the end of life. But even if it was a week that they could have had extra, or 2 weeks with their, you know, loved ones.
Your mother was put in palliative care at least 14 months before she died.
3.5 years originally.
Right. Yeah. But the palliative care should be the last 3.5 days maximum to me. Do you know what I mean?
Well, no, because I think that's a misconception. I think people confuse end-of-life care and palliative care. Now, palliative care should be basically this person could go either way. Obviously, if you've got cancer and you've got palliative, you're under palliative care, which, by the way, only 30% of people who need palliative care actually get it, and they only get it in the last days, weeks, and possibly months of life. That is because it's rationed. There isn't enough of it. But palliative care should not be about this person is dying and, you know, that person needs to be supported, treated for their conditions. And obviously, if they are dying and they're in the last days and weeks of life, you don't want to invade them with treatments that are futile. But on the other hand, prognosis are often so very wrong. I mean, I think it's something like 67% of the prognosis made by medics are wrong. Now, sometimes they overestimate how long somebody's got, sometimes they underestimate. But, you know, there are many, many cases of people being told that they are end of life and actually living for months and sometimes years longer, as in my mum's case.
Incredible. Look, thanks very much for the time that you've given me today. And hopefully I can talk to you again in the future about the other thing that's on my sort of hit list, and that's the, I don't really know how to term it as assisted suicide, as it might be.
Well, it's called assisted dying, isn't it? But I think we should call a spade a spade. This is assisted suicide. This is the state assisting you.
Letting you commit a crime.
Sorry?
Letting you commit a crime. And one of the weirdest crimes, I think, is committing suicide is actually a crime. So that means if you...
Well, suicide isn't a crime. It's not a crime. No, suicide isn't a crime.
You're never going to take anybody to court for it.
Euthanasia is a crime.
Yes.
But we already basically have I would call it assisted dying in the NHS, because the NHS is rationing care, and what is happening is managed decline, and people are being fast-tracked to premature death. And not enough people know about this. And I think if they understood what was actually happening now, they'd be terrified of the assisted suicide bill coming.
Well, I think they would be as concerned as you obviously are, and as concerned I am. And hopefully we can do part 2 on that when you're home, and we can do that over the internet one day. And because it is something that you touched on before we came to turn the cameras on. And I thought, that's a topic that interests me as well.
Well, they're very much linked, because these protocols are basically fast-tracking people to early graves. If assisted suicide legislation comes in and the medic can suggest that this is an option available and is giving the person, you know, a 6 months prognosis, which could be very wrong, how many people are going to die prematurely and feel that they are a burden on the state, on the NHS, or a burden on their family? We've already got now people who are unmet needs, people who are been denied treatment, been denied care. They're languishing in hospital beds because there's no social care available. We've got huge capacity problems. So people are languishing in hospital beds. You know, it doesn't take a huge leap of the imagination, does it? No. For somebody who's been denied assistance in hospital, being left, you know, neglected and, allowed to decline, no, rehabilitation, no sort of help with, strengthening them and getting better, and then waiting for a care package that never materialises. You know, they don't want to be a burden on their families. How many people, with this 6 months prognosis are going to say, oh, yeah, let me go earlier?
Yeah, and it's a family thing that they don't want to be a burden. But most of these old people are very, very determined, very respectful, very loads of standards and things, and they think, well, I'm going to be a burden on them. And they, they can face death quite happily. And, that you're right, it's a concern. But listen, I can't say it enough. Thanks very much. Your story is inspiring, and I hope others, if they get to that point with their own families, they they have the desire to.
Well, on that point, we have actually, it's taken us time to bring this together, but we've actually written some guidance. So I do encourage people to look us up. That's EOL Watch on Twitter. And we will shortly be publishing our guidance for families of what to expect when they get into hospital and how to deal with the.
Yeah, well, I can share some links on the description. This video will go out predominantly on YouTube, and the description I can put some great details in there. So, listen, thanks very much, and safe journey home.
Thank you.
Everyone else, have a great day. Cheerio, bye now.